The flotilla was made up of ships from the defense industry's stellar defense subsidiaries, built by the megacorporations that made up that industry. It came in only a few 100,000 kilometers from the resonance zone, streaking in with a flare of jump space energies that quickly dissipated. Once a full accountability was done and the ships checked for any problems, it moved steadily in system. The stellar mass was bright yellow, almost blinding compared to the energetic orange-yellow star the Ch.31 had grown to maturity under. There were 6 gas giants, including 1 hypermassive gas giant, all with moons, 3 with rings. There were 8 planets, including a fairly large planet furthest out. Only one was near the green zone for the Ch.31, but it was nothing more than blasted and cratered rock. The one of interest was firmly in the orange zone, the atmosphere hot and humid, the seas full of salts and minerals, with erratic weather and ice caps on the poles. The world had a debris ring and a larger moon further out from the debris ring, which had tendrils that were slowly following the moon. The world had a supermassive continent that had only recently begun separating, deep canyons and narrow seas along the fault lines. The only life was simple multicellular life and single-celled organisms. Fungi, protoplasm, bacteria, simple life forms, all hardy enough to survive the harsh stellar rays from the sun. The flotilla moved to the planet and took up orbit. The moon was scanned. The scientists, researchers, technicians, and industry representatives all waited with bated breath to see the results. Ruins. Craters blown in the moon. A thin atmosphere. Howling background radiation. Wreckage from a terrible fight that surrounded 2 massive facilities, one on the side facing the planet, the other facing away from the planet. Interestingly enough, there were 6 long lines of wreckage. The research industry reps met together, discussing if those locations should be examined as the planet itself was scanned from orbit. The planet's core was still wobbling slightly, a liquid iron/nickel core spinning the opposite of the planet itself. The atmosphere was harsh, low in oxygen, high in CO2 and nitrogen. The winds could reach up to an astonishing 40 kilometers per hour. Clouds gathered in huge spiraling bands to drop heavy rains on the planet's surface. The sea smashed against the seashore with roaring fury. Ecological industry researchers gleefully began modeling the planet's ecology and weather systems, as well as its magnetic field and how much radiation it absorbed from the planet. The vast supercomputer arrays in the research industry vessels spun up and went to work. After a discussion, it was agreed to use various drones to examine the surface. Much of the surface was covered with soft lichen and moss of various colors, but it could not hide the telltale patterns of detritus from a terrible battle. Drones were deployed to the moon also, first following the paths of wreckage and devastation. In places there were lines of small craters. While the Ch.31 had never used atomic weapons in anger, they had detonated a few for experimental reasons, so the craters' origins were obvious to Ch.31 researchers. Someone, sometime, for some reason, had used atomic weaponry of vast power, nearly 50 kilotons, in a line to destroy something. The drones swept along the line, dutifully recording. They were kept high enough to not disturb the lunar dust as they moved along. A line of boxes beneath the dust between 2 long series of craters attracted attention. Teams of theorists from the defense industry, the transportation industry, and the science industry all debated what those boxes could be. Eventually a drone, equipped with fans that could move the thin atmosphere, was moved over one of the boxes and used to blow away the thick dust slowly and steadily, recording it all in high fidelity. The last few millimeters of dust were all radioactive, their energy signature consistent with what the Ch.31 had researched after detonating atomic weapons. Beneath the dust was a container on its side. On the exposed bottom of the container was high technology. The drone took high-resolution images, and those images were forwarded to the researchers. It became quickly apparent that the technology was not that of servants of Narvaka, but rather it was consistent with the enemy that the servants of Narvaka had been locked in combat with. It was a researcher from the transportation industry that recognized the alien technology. Maglev Systems. The collective groan could be heard throughout the flotilla, as everyone realized what they were looking at was a high-speed maglev cargo train that had slowed down and then fallen over once the power had been cut to the train itself and the tracks it had been on. However, the dust had settled on the cargo box, concealing the paint, before the stellar radiation could bleach it away, unlike the majority of the other relics they had discovered. The runes were blocky, almost aggressive. Pictures were taken and forwarded to researchers back on Narvoka's gift. The writing of the great enemy captured the public's imagination. When the research industry offered financial and status rewards for translations, it became a species fad that quickly spread. Even students taught by the education industry as young as 10 years old took part in trying to decipher them. There were puzzles and images of them in every social media, from printed plas scream sheets to match games to graffiti in videos. The entertainment industry made the first breakthrough, identifying the numerical symbols. The teenage female musician who had not only identified the numerical symbols, but then reasoned out how the great enemy did basic math, found herself with the best tutors and the best instruments and featured in entertainment industry media. The music subsidiary of the entertainment, educational, and cultural industries found itself on the ascendant. The musical prodigy had proven that the great enemy used base 10 for their math, not base 12 like the Ch.31. The research industry shook its head. It should have been obvious, as the great enemy had 5 grasping digits on their hands if you counted the strange opposable thumbs. The great enemy had 1 on each hand, where the Ch.31 had 1 on each side of the hand with an additional joint compared to the great enemy. Research continued as the drones moved over the wreckage. The ruins of the servants of Narvoka were obvious as always. Crystalline, long flowing lines, ramps and balconies. The shells of great insects were consistent with servant of Narvoka ruins, all of the remaining chitin showing vast damage on the moon. Like most worlds with weather and life, the chitin was gone, erased by the march of time, weather, and hungry simple organisms. Images of the world captured the imagination of the Ch.31 public. Never before had great enemy ruins been in such pristine condition, never had the ruins been so intact, never had the ruins promised to hold terrible secrets and possibly horrible wondrous knowledge. The theology industry counseled caution, that the Ch.31 were treading in the footsteps of ancient powers whose technology was so advanced as to be akin to magic. The Sci industry cautioned the research flotilla to be extremely wary, that the more research was done into the servants of Narvoka, the more it became apparent that they were skilled at psionic powers, which meant the great enemy would have to be able to resist the urge to worship and please the servants of Narvoka. That meant that they would be powerful psions and psychics. While the massive war machines, damaged spaceships, and shattered aerospace craft had not shown any psionic mechanisms, the Sci industry counseled caution, reminding everyone that the security charges had done their work in destroying valuable information and critical equipment. Most of the wreckage of the great enemy was just superstructure wrapped around destroyed junk, all of it having self-destructed to protect the great enemy's secrets. Drones carefully blew away the dust layer by layer, taking readings of every speck of lunar dust. On the planet's surface, the drones stayed high enough to not disturb the surface, while using high-definition telescopic lenses to record every last arc, corner, and slope of the lichen and tough hidden ruins and wreckage. The defense industry scientists pointed out that it looked as if the servants of Narvoka and the great enemy had been engaged in combat, based on how the equipment and the ruins were arranged, when it just all stopped. The defense industry warned the others that there could be hidden dangers, such as unstable, unexploded ordnance, live weapon systems, possibly even hidden energy sources. A new set of drones and probes swept over the moon and the planet, scanning for even the most well-shielded power source. No known power source was detected, but the defense industry and the science industry warned that this was the most intact of the great enemy's relics and war material, and the great enemy's technology was so advanced that perhaps they would not be able to recognize power sources used by the great enemy. The Ch.31 moved with the utmost caution. After all, There was no hurry. As far as the Ch.31 knew, they were alone in the universe, the great enemy and the servants of Narvoka having destroyed one another, and leaving behind only the Ch.31 as intelligent life. Mathematically, it was highly improbable that there was intelligent life anywhere else in the galaxy, as it seemed like all intelligent life had wiped one another out before the Ch.31 had even begun to dabble in agriculture. So there was no hurry, no reason to rush and possibly make mistakes. The Ch.31 lively debated whether or not that was the curse of intelligent life, that they would encounter other intelligent life and inevitably seek to extinguish the other as soon as they met. To some Ch.31, the idea of non-Ch.31 intelligent life was abhorrent and disgusting, invoking feelings of revulsion and physical sickness. In others it caused fear, just as strong as viewing the symbols of the great enemy. They debated, was it the natural order of the universe that two species of intelligent life would have no choice but to wipe one another out? Was that what had happened before the Ch.31 had even left their plains and rolling hills? The theology industry debated the near heresy that perhaps the servants of Narvoka were not the servants of the god, but perhaps deceivers and betrayers. Just viewing the vacuum-desiccated corpse of one of the purple bipeds was enough to make someone suffer from insanity and seek to please a long-dead corpse with praise and gifts. Would an actual servant of the god Narvoka twist and beguile the mind in such a way to force adulation and worship? Had the great enemy attempted to throw off the worship of the servants of Narvoka so that they could not be forced to worship and adulation? These questions burned at the center of the theology industry. The justice industry watched carefully to make sure theological arguments did not break into physical violence. Intellectual violence was how questions were formed and answered, but the justice industry would not allow it to move to physical violence against the public and warned the theology industry of that fact. All the while, the scientific expedition looked over what was revealed. The Morse and lichen seemed to be able to get through the tightest seals and seams, at times eating into the metal itself slowly but surely. Samples were taken and examined closely, an entire scientific vessel dedicated to the Morse and lichen itself, another set of vessels dedicated to the simple multicellular organisms. The crews of the vessel lived in their environmental suits, using Deccan procedures to move to another vessel entirely to rest, eat, or relax. The Ch.31 were careful in their examinations. Who knew what adaptations evolution had forced living organisms to embrace in order to survive and thrive on a world where the servants of Narvoka had grappled with the great enemy? Who knew what dangers those adaptations could present to the Ch.31? A set of probes across the far side of the planet, where there was only a large scattering of islands, found something that made every scientist, technician, and researcher watch the feed. Life. There were small, scrubby trees, little amphibians, small avians, insects. There were even crustaceans, mollusks, and trilobites in the tidal pools. The Ch.31 just stayed back and watched, observing only with stealth probes. The ocean around the island teemed with life. Seaweed, fish, algae, mollusks, more trilobites. The life ended at the continental plate shelves around the islands. The researchers, technicians, and scientists turned their attention back to the main continent as more and more debris was carefully uncovered from the volcanic ash tuff and the soil that the lichen had broken the tuff down into. Now they were finding new armors, built for powerful creatures taller than the Ch.31, with thick limbs and bodies, 5 fingers, a large head that was squarish compared to the conical rear sweep of the Ch.31 head that was reminiscent of the servants of Narvoka's skulls. The armor was all breached, filled with soil that was carefully sampled. Organic compounds that could be argued came from the lichen as it broke down the volcanic dust, died, and then was utilized by the next round of lichen. The breaches were undeniably from violence. Torn off limbs, huge caved-in craters or rents in the torso, severed heads. The armor was scarred, pockmarked. Microprobes checked inside the armor, looking for any tissue or any kind of remains. The armor was empty, although high levels of phosphorus and calcium were detected. Additionally, lichen samples were found that did not correspond with any of the lichen species so prevalent. It was theorized that those lichens had only existed inside the armor. There were patches of lichen that were odd. The samples showed they were capable of competing with the other lichens, but they produced oxygen when exposed to UV, breaking down CO2 and CO. Those lichens were found mostly around the large areas of destroyed armor. The scientists and researchers were suddenly alerted to something new. Something so new it had not even required computer analysis of traces. The first images were viewed with shock and awe. More than a few of the scientists, technicians, representatives, experts, and researchers knelt down and pressed the front of their T-shaped faces to deck plating or floors upon their first view. At the bottom of one of the continental shelves was a huge landslide. Ancient and from long ago, a section of the shelf had broken off and slid down into the depths of the ocean. A fluke of hydrodynamics and gravity had caused the rear of the section to fall first, meaning the face of the massive cliff had slid down and ended up at an angle, facing the surface of the ocean. It was huge. It was obviously artificial. The visage of one of the servants of Narvoka, done in greenish-black stone. The tentacles were parted to reveal the conical mouth. The three eyes were wide open, with the pupil wide. The servant of Narvoka was clad in a fine robe, holding a staff topped with a crescent moon that a massive crystal floated inside. The crystal was dark, but was unmistakable. It stood before a carved arch, graven with strange, unknowable runes inlaid with crystal. Fish moved around in front of it, but while undersea algae covered the rocks around it, the rock of the statue had not been smeared with algae or undersea fungus. When the image was transferred back to Narvoka's gift, the industries realized that if the image was shown, there would be panic and religious hysteria-driven riots in the street. The leaders of the industrial boards met, wringing their hands about what to do, making nervous fluting noises through the breathing slits in their necks. But things had progressed at the research site. By backtracking the collapse, the researchers had searched the cliff face of the continental shelf. There they found two things of interest. The first was some kind of underwater vessel. It had sunk to the bottom and been mostly covered by silt and volcanic ash that had sunk into the water. What had caused the vessel to sink was unknown, as what its purpose was. It was shaped like a long tube, with a small section on one side in the middle. There were propellers at the rear, along with a guidance rudder. The thought of traveling underwater trapped in a metal tube made the Ch.31 nervous. The second was several gaps in the cliff face. The biggest was obviously a crater created by an atomic weapon. Now the researchers and archaeologists knew what had happened. Somehow there had been an atomic detonation behind the graven facade that had ripped the statuary from the cliffside and caused it to collapse to the bottom of the ocean. The other gaps were smaller, and when the first probes entered, the researchers all gathered around monitors to watch. They were passages. Doorways were discovered, all smashed in. The closer ones obviously had succumbed to the overpressure wave of the atomic. Others, further in, showed silent marks of pinpoint explosive use. Still others showed deep dents that computer modeling proved were made by the great enemy's clenched fists. There were spiraling slopes that were obviously some kind of ramps to upper levels. At one point, a drone reached the top of the water, bobbing silently. The scans showed algae on the walls of the room. A nest of tiny crabs was disturbed by the light and scurried into the water. The doors were buckled, so an amphibious drone was designed and built on the fabrication ship. The passageways were followed, the drone always careful not to disturb things. Fallen armor, showing more signs of violence. The carnage and debris grew thicker and thicker the further into the labyrinth the probes moved. The algae coated the walls, underground lichen clung to the stone, the metals to every surface. Small creatures, simple trilobite and crustacean life forms, moved in the lichen with their busy, simple little dim lives. With a shock, one researcher noted that a suit of armor would have fit a much shorter version of the Ch.31. The T-shaped head was unique. It was obvious, at that moment, that the great enemy had also been fighting ancestors of the Ch.31. Further in, the violent scars seemed to ramp up. Long burned slag marks on the walls. The floors cracked and damaged from explosives. Fist-sized craters in the walls. Scattered armor. Here and there were the armors of the great enemy. Not many. One researcher estimated that there was only one great enemy armor for every 200 other armors, the great enemy armor always showing signs of extended combat, as if they had to be shot to pieces to stop the great enemy. No remains. Here and there a small creature was living inside the helmet, peeking out as the probe went by. Finally, two great doors were ahead. The doors flattened onto the ground and shattered. A light emanated from within the chamber beyond, and the probe floated inside. Those watching eagerly only had a few seconds to take in the view. Scattered great enemy armor littered the floor. Shards of sparkling crystal were everywhere. In the middle of the room was a single vast crystal, floating in mid-air. Inside was one of the servants of Narvoka, clad in finery, holding a staff with 3 crystals inside the arc of the crescent moon. As the Ch.31 stared, the 3 eyes opened.